On January 26, 1945, Holtzwihr, France, the earth was frozen, and the sky stretched out as a lifeless sheet of gray. Smoke crawled across the battlefield, clinging to the wreckage of broken trees and frozen soldiers. From the east came the unmistakable sound of metal, tank treads grinding against the frozen earth, followed by the deliberate, measured steps of German infantry. 6 tanks and a company of troops advanced relentlessly on a single, battered American unit. At the front stood a young lieutenant, just 19 years old, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, wounded in the leg, soaked in mud and blood. His name was Audie Murphy, and he would not retreat. With his men falling back behind him and a burning tank destroyer by his side, Audie climbed onto the flaming wreckage and grabbed a mounted .50 caliber machine gun, opening fire. Alone, exposed, surrounded, he fought on. For more than an hour, he repelled the enemy, calling in artillery strikes and refusing to give ground. When the fight ended, the field was littered with the bodies of the fallen, and Audie led a counterattack. Later, someone asked why he stayed behind. His reply, simple and unforgettable: "They were killing my friends." That was how a poor farm boy from Texas, too small, too poor, and too forgotten, became the most decorated American soldier of World War II. This is his story. Before he ever held a rifle or wore medals, Audie Leon Murphy had known the bitterness of hunger. Born on June 20th, 1925, in a dilapidated sharecropper shack near Kingston, Texas, he was the 7th of 12 children. His childhood was filled with cracked earth, hammer-down boots, and a life dictated by hard labor and survival. His father was often absent, while his mother, Josie, worked tirelessly to keep the family together. By the time most boys his age were learning their times tables, Audie was learning how to trap rabbits, shoot squirrels, and stretch a nickel to make ends meet. School ended for him after the 5th grade. Cotton didn't wait for algebra. He hunted not for sport, but for survival, using his rifle as a means to provide for his siblings. There was no safety net, no government assistance, just a boy, a gun, and the harsh Texas wind. Yet amid the hardship, a quiet strength took root in him, patience, resilience, and a quiet defiance. He learned that the land gives you nothing unless you fight for it. Every dawn was a test, every meal a hard-won victory. And in that unyielding soil, a soldier was being shaped, though neither Audie nor anyone else could have known it yet. When his mother passed away in 1941, Audie, at just 16, became the family's provider. Too young to be the leader, yet too old to pretend he wasn't trying, he assumed responsibility for his siblings. But inside, a storm was brewing. He didn't dream of medals or glory. He dreamed of escape. When the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, it gave Audie his chance. He wouldn't just escape the farm. He would fight for something greater than himself. He just needed the army to accept him. The Murphy household had no electricity, no running water, no phone. But when the news of Pearl Harbor broke, it spread like wildfire. Audie stood there, fists clenched, his eyes burning with a determination no one had ever seen before. This was his moment. To most, war was an unimaginable horror. To Audie, it was an opportunity, a way out. He dreamed not of fame or glory, but of meals he didn't have to hunt for, boots that fit, and freedom from the suffocating life of the cotton fields. But the army didn't see a soldier. They saw a 5 feet 5 inches, 110-pound teenager with a limited education. Audie didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a kid who had gotten lost on his way to the market. Rejected. He tried the Marines, the Navy, and the Airborne. Each time, the answer was the same. No, you're too small, too young. They told him to come back when he was a man. Every rejection stung, but the worst part wasn't a no, it was a look they gave him, as if he didn't matter, as if he would never matter. For a boy who had already carried the weight of his family on his shoulders, those rejections didn't just hurt, they humiliated him. But if there was one thing the land had taught him, it was this: if the plow breaks, you fix it. If the crops fail, you replant. And if the world says no, you make it say yes. So Audie went home, but not for long. With the help of his sister, Karen, he forged his birth certificate, changing the year to make himself 17, the minimum age to enlist. She signed her name, and Audie memorized the lie. Then, with resolve, he went back to the same recruiting office. This time, he stood tall. No fear, no doubt, just one sentence. I'm here to serve. On June 30th, 1942, the United States Army accepted him. He was 17 on paper, but only 16 in truth, a boy who had been raised by hard work and hardship, but who had no idea that in 3 years he would stand atop a burning tank destroyer, holding of a German assault. For now, though, he wore a simple uniform and boarded a train to boot camp, leaving behind the fields of Hunt County, Texas. He didn't look back. There were no tears, no speeches, just one suitcase, a heart full of defiance, and a mind already preparing for war. What he was trying to prove wasn't to the recruiters, but to himself, that his life, his pain, his struggle meant something. That he could be more than just a poor boy from nowhere. He could matter. By the time Audie Murphy stepped off a troop ship into Casablanca, North Africa, on February 20th, 1943, the boy from Hunt County was already beginning to fade. In his place stood a soldier, one who would go on to become one of the most decorated military figures in history. It wasn't the grand speeches or heroic actions that defined Audie Murphy. Instead, it was quiet courage, built on years of struggle. No theatrics, just raw action. As the war raged on, his kill count increased, but so did the respect of his men. He didn't appear heroic, but in battle, he fought like one. While others tried to make sense of the chaos, Audie adhered to one simple rule: protect the man next to you. His fight wasn't driven by politics or glory. It was a memory of empty plates, graves dug too soon, and promises made to a mother who never saw her son in uniform. Audie wasn't fighting for medals or headlines. He fought because life had taught him the cost of losing. And somewhere in the hills of Sicily, that poor farm boy became a warrior, not because of rank or orders, but because, when it mattered most, he moved forward when others froze. Italy, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome. The campaign that was supposed to be a soft entry into Europe became a nightmare. On September 9th, 1943, during Operation Avalanche, Audie and his unit landed on the beach at Salerno. It looked peaceful from the water, but reality hit hard as machine gun fire tore through the air, mortar shells exploded on the beach, and bodies floated in the surf. Audie jumped into the water, boots sinking in the blood-soaked sand, rifle raised, chest heaving, not with fear, but with unwavering focus. This was no movie. This was real war. In the chaos, Audie learned quickly, cover was life. Hesitation was death. His comrades fell, but Audie dragged a wounded man out of the surf with one hand while firing with the other. There were no speeches or glory, just survival. From Salerno, the advance toward the north was grueling and slow. Italy's terrain was a nightmare, narrow mountain roads, thick forests, and towns nestled into cliffs. The Germans turned every inch into a trap. Olive groves concealed snipers, and stone walls had explosives. Then came Anzio, on January 22nd, 1944. Another amphibious landing. Another death trap. The Allies had planned to land behind German lines and break the stalemate, but nothing in Italy went according to plan. The beachhead became a coffin. The Allies dug in, waiting for a breakthrough that wouldn't come for months. It rained for days, turning trenches into swamps. Rats thrived, and morale crumbled. Murphy's unit endured freezing temperatures, constant shelling, and relentless hunger. Then malaria struck. For weeks, Audie's body trembled with fever. His skin burned, his muscles ached, but he refused evacuation. He wouldn't leave his men behind. Rest only came when hallucinations blurred the line between friend and foe. Even then, he returned, pale but determined. "You're going to die out here," someone once told him. Murphy didn't answer. He simply reloaded his rifle because he hadn't come this far to die in a hospital bed. By the time the Allies broke out of Anzio and moved toward Rome, Murphy had become leaner, harder, and older than any calendar could measure. He'd watched friends die in the mud, carried the wounded through mortar fire, and buried soldiers younger than him. But something else was happening, too. When officers fell, Murphy took charge. When morale broke, he held the line. No one called him a hero, but in the darkest moments, they looked for Audie. They knew he wouldn't flinch. They knew he wouldn't quit. And in war, that reliability was rarer than any medal. When Audie's boots finally touched the ancient streets of Rome, he didn't receive fame or headlines. He earned only the quiet respect of those who had seen him survive the worst and still stand tall. Italy wasn't just a campaign. It was a crucible that forged Audie Murphy into something both his enemies and commanders could no longer ignore. A born leader, hardened in mud and fire, still just getting started. The summer of 1944 saw the Allied forces in the south of France, and Audie Murphy was there. While most of the world focused on the beaches of Normandy, the invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon, was underway. Audie landed at Yellow Beach near Ramatuelle under the Mediterranean sun. The scenery was beautiful, but the war wasn't. The Germans, retreating through the hills and forests of southern France, weren't giving up easily. They were setting traps, laying mines, and fighting fiercely. Audie's unit led the charge into these treacherous woods. They advanced through valleys lined with pine trees and stone walls, always on edge. In those dense forests, every rock could conceal machine gun nests, every farmhouse could be booby-trapped. And then one day, it happened. In October 1944, the unit found itself in a quiet quarry. It seemed like a perfect place to regroup. But Audie's instincts told him something was wrong. The silence was too perfect. The birds had stopped singing, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Without warning, machine guns opened up from the ridges above. Audie didn't hesitate. While others scrambled for cover, he moved forward, rifle in hand, seeking the source of the fire. He didn't wait for orders or backup. He was hunting. He spotted the German position, moved closer, and eliminated the threat. But just as he finished, a second enemy position opened fire, and a bullet hit him in the hip. The pain was excruciating, but Audie didn't stop. He stayed low, repositioned himself, and kept fighting. He laid down fire until the rest of his unit regrouped, allowing them to push forward. The Germans retreated, and Audie's unit took the quarry. He was only 19 years old. The official report would call it a notable engagement, but for his men, it was something else. They had watched a wounded boy take on 2 fortified enemy positions and keep fighting despite his injury. They stopped calling him short and started calling him a killer. But Audie never bragged or celebrated. By then, he had changed. He wasn't fighting for medals or victory anymore. He was fighting for survival, for his comrades, for the ones who had already fallen. The war had taught him that fear was irrelevant, not because he thought he couldn't die, but because he had nothing left to lose. By January 26, 1945, the war had reached Holtzwihr, France. The cold had turned the earth to ice, and Audie Murphy stood once again on the front lines, despite still being wounded. Behind him, 35 exhausted men, low on ammunition and hope. Ahead of him, 6 German tanks and 200 infantry advancing in the fog. Audie called for artillery support, but the radio relay was frozen. Time had run out. Without hesitation, he turned to his men and ordered them to fall back to the trees. Then he stayed behind. Alone, he faced the advancing tanks. His men hesitated, but Audie didn't. He stood his ground and prepared to make his final stand. It wasn't the speeches or grand gestures that defined Audie Murphy. It was quiet, unflinching courage. His kill count grew, and so did the respect of his men. He didn't look like a hero, but when it mattered, he fought like one. While others sought meaning in the madness, Audie stuck to one rule: protect the man next to you. He wasn't fighting for politics or glory. He was fighting for survival, for the memory of empty plates, of early graves, and promises made to a mother who never got to see her son in uniform. Audie wasn't a soldier for fame or medals. He fought because life had shown him the price of losing. In the hills of Sicily, that poor farm boy became a warrior, not by rank or orders, but because, when the battle seemed impossible, he pressed forward while others faltered. Italy, Salerno, Anzio, Rome, was supposed to be a soft entry into Europe, but for Audie Murphy, it became a hell's cape of blood, smoke, and stone. On September 9, 1943, during Operation Avalanche, Audie landed at Salerno. From the water, the beach looked serene. But once Audie's landing craft hit the shore, machine gun fire ripped through the air, and mortar shells exploded in sand. Bodies drifted in the surf. The beachhead became a killing field. Audie leapt into the water, boots sinking in blood-soaked sand, rifle held high, heart racing, but focused. This wasn't a drill. This was war, raw and real. He saw comrades fall as they tried to step out of the boat. Without hesitation, Audie pulled a man out of the surf while firing with one hand. No speeches, no glory, just survival. The advance through Italy was slow and punishing. The terrain was a nightmare, narrow mountain roads, dense forests, towns carved into cliffs. The Germans turned every inch into a trap. Olive groves had snipers, and stone walls concealed explosives. Then came Anzio, January 22nd, 1944. Another amphibious landing. Another death trap. The Allies had planned to land behind German lines to break the stalemate and push towards Rome, but nothing went according to plan. The beachhead became a grave. The soldiers dug in, waiting for a breakthrough that wouldn't come. Rain flooded the trenches, turning them into swamps. Rats flourished, and morale crumbled. Murphy's unit endured the freezing temperatures, endless shelling, and starvation. Then malaria struck. Audie suffered weeks of fever and hallucinations, but refused evacuation. He wouldn't leave his men behind. Even as his body shook with fever, he returned to the front lines, pale but determined. "You're going to die out here," someone said. Audie didn't respond. He just reloaded his rifle because he hadn't come this far to die in a hospital bed. By the time the Allies broke out of Anzio and moved toward Rome, Audie had become leaner, harder, and older than anyone could imagine. He had witnessed friends die, carried men through mortar fire, and buried comrades younger than himself. But something else was happening. When officers fell, Audie took charge. When morale shattered, he stood firm. He wasn't called a hero. But when things went wrong, his men looked for Audie. They knew he didn't flinch. They knew he didn't quit. And in war, that was rarer than any medal. By the time Audie's boots stepped onto the streets of Rome, he hadn't earned fame or glory. He had earned the quiet respect of men who had seen him walk through hell and not break. Italy wasn't just a campaign. It was a crucible that forged Audie Murphy into something his enemies couldn't explain and his commanders couldn't ignore. A natural-born leader, shaped by mud, fire, and pain, and still just getting started. In the summer of 1944, while much of the world focused on Normandy, Audie was part of Operation Dragoon in southern France. He landed at Yellow Beach near Ramachou under a clear Mediterranean sky. The vineyards were lush and the sand warm, but the war was far from serene. The Germans, retreating through the hills and forests of southern France, weren't running. They were fighting hard, setting traps, and delaying the Allies' advance. Audie's unit was at the front, advancing through tight forests and valleys, always alert. Every rock could hide a machine gun nest, and every farmhouse could be a trap. One morning, Audie's instincts told him something was wrong. The silence was too still. And then the machine gun fire erupted from the ridges above. Audie didn't hesitate. While others scrambled for cover, he crawled forward, rifle in hand, looking for the source of the fire. He wasn't following orders or buying time. He was hunting. He spotted a German position and, belly to the ground, crept closer. He squeezed the trigger, dropping 4 enemy soldiers. As a 5th soldier aimed his weapon, Audie fired again, but a second position opened fire, hitting him in the hip. The pain was intense, but Audie didn't stop. He stayed low, repositioned himself, and continued firing until his unit could regroup and push forward. The Germans retreated. The quarry was theirs. At just 19 years old, Audie had taken on 2 fortified enemy positions while wounded and kept fighting. His men stopped calling him short and started calling him a killer. But Audie never bragged. By then, he had changed. He wasn't fighting for medals or victory. He was fighting for survival, for the men beside him, and for those who had already fallen. As the war raged on, Audie realized the odds didn't scare him. Not because he thought he couldn't die, but because he had nothing left to lose. January 26, 1945, found Audie in Holtzwihr, France, near the German border. The air was cold, the earth iced over, but Audie stood firm. His legs still ached from the bullet wound he had taken months earlier in Sicily, but he refused to leave the front. Behind him were 35 exhausted men, low on ammunition and hope. Ahead of him were 6 German tanks and 200 infantry advancing through the fog. Audie called for artillery support, but the radio failed. Time had run out. Without hesitation, he ordered his men to fall back to the trees. Then Audie stayed behind. Alone, facing the German tanks, he prepared to make his stand. At one point, Audie Murphy slept on the floor, a pistol beneath his arm, convinced the Germans were still coming. The war had ended in Europe, but inside Audie, it never truly stopped. Friends urged him to seek therapy, but he refused. Soldiers don't complain, he would say. So, he buried his pain, masking it beneath layers of silence and politeness. The boy who once stood alone against tanks now fought a battle he couldn't see or shoot at. He also fought guilt, the unshakable weight of survivor's guilt. He couldn't stop asking himself, why me? Why had he survived when so many better men hadn't? Sometimes he would look at his medals and feel sick. They don't mean anything to the dead, he said. Fame only made it worse. Everywhere he went, people expected him to smile, speak, and shake hands, but what he needed most was peace, and he couldn't find it. Audie later admitted that he would sometimes lock himself in a dark room for days, refusing to eat or speak. The only companion he could tolerate was a loaded weapon. Years later, when asked why he never took his own life, Audie gave the most Audie Murphy answer imaginable: because I had people who needed me. Even in the depths of his pain, he thought of others. That was both his curse and his quiet, heartbreaking strength. Hollywood and horses became a part of his legacy. The war gave Audie a story, and Hollywood turned it into a myth. In 1945, actor James Cagney invited Audie to Los Angeles after reading about his war record. The idea was simple: make a movie star out of America's most decorated soldier. Audie was skeptical. He never saw himself as an actor, let alone a hero. But the offers kept coming. Studio heads loved his boyish face, his quiet demeanor, and his impossible story. So, he stayed. He took acting lessons, sat through auditions, and memorized scripts. He never felt comfortable, but he needed the money. Once again, he went to war, but this time it was on screen. He starred in more than 40 films over the next 2 decades, most of them westerns where he played quiet, reluctant gunslingers, men who didn't seek trouble but were deadly when pushed. In truth, he was just playing himself. But one role stood apart. In 1955, Audie starred in To Hell and Back, the film adaptation of his own memoir. Reliving his battlefield trauma for the cameras, Audie didn't use a stunt double. He didn't fake the emotions, because none of it needed to be faked. Every scene pulled him back to the places he had tried to bury: Sicily, Anzio, Holtz. Every gunshot echoed inside his chest. Every explosion rewound a memory he couldn't escape. He once said, "I was just doing my job." But now that job was packaged, sold, and replayed in theaters across the country. And when the credits rolled, he was still alone. Behind the cameras, Audie struggled with his demons. Nightmares came often, waking him in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He drank, gambled recklessly, and fell into debt. At one point, he locked himself in a hotel room for a week, armed and shaking, convinced the enemy was coming. But there was no enemy, just the memories of war. Yet, he still showed up on set, still signed autographs, still carried the weight. When asked why he didn't walk away from fame, he said, "It helps me take care of my family." That was always at the core of Audie Murphy. Not pride, not ego, but responsibility. In his private life, Audie found peace with horses. He bred and raised quarter horses on a small ranch, spending hours brushing them and riding the trails in silence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't expect speeches. Audie also became an advocate for post-traumatic stress long before it had a name. He urged Congress to recognize the psychological wounds of war. He wrote quiet, sad songs. He refused to endorse cigarette or alcohol ads, not wanting to set a bad example for the kids who looked up to him. Audie knew the power of image, but he never let it replace the truth. In the end, Audie Murphy was a man who wore 2 uniforms, one for battle and one for the cameras, but the war never stopped wearing him down. And still, he showed up every single day. By the 1960s, Audie Murphy had become an icon, a war hero turned movie star, the embodiment of American grit. But behind that icon was a man quietly cracking. The pressures never ceased. The war was always with him, like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. He battled insomnia, guilt, and chronic anxiety. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. Sudden movements made him freeze. He avoided fireworks, couldn't stand crowds, and would sometimes stare blankly at walls for hours, trapped in memories that no one else could see. His fame, once a lifeline, had become a cage. Debt piled up. He invested in oil drilling and horse breeding, but most ventures failed. He turned down lucrative endorsements because he didn't want to set a bad example for young people. But that decision cost him the income he desperately needed. He refused pity, refused handouts, but privately, he was drowning. When asked why he didn't speak more openly about his struggles, Audie replied, "Because I don't want to make excuses. I just want to get through the day." On January 28, 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a private plane with 5 others for a business meeting in Virginia. The weather was poor. Fog and rain reduced visibility. The pilot was not certified for instrument flight. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain, Virginia, killing all 6 on board. Audie Murphy was 45 years old. News of his death stunned the nation. He had survived the deadliest combat zones of World War II, faced tanks with nothing but a machine gun, lived through malaria, bullet wounds, and battles that wiped out entire units. But it was a quiet mountain on a cloudy morning that finally took him. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave, simple and unadorned, bore just his name. No bragging, no titles, just the way he wanted it. Even in death, his grave drew crowds. Today, it is one of the most visited graves at Arlington, second only to President John F. Kennedy's. Visitors come not for spectacle, but to stand before the resting place of a man who gave more than anyone should be asked. A man who never sought the spotlight, but bore it because others couldn't. A man who once said, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." His tombstone doesn't list his medals, but the silence around it speaks volumes. In a world full of noise, Audie Murphy's story still resonates. It isn't just about medals or glory. It's about meaning. It's about understanding the true cost of courage, not for a moment, but for a lifetime. Audie Murphy wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was a poor farmer's son from a forgotten corner of Texas. No money, no education, no special training. The military didn't want him at first. Too small, too young, too light. But he became the most decorated American soldier of World War II, not because of power or politics, but because when it mattered most, he stood firm. When others hesitated, he moved forward. He didn't fight to prove something. He fought because someone had to. He didn't take the hill for glory. He took it because someone behind him might die if he didn't. That is the kind of bravery that echoes through time. It's the kind of bravery that says, "I'll go. I won't run. I'll hold the line." In battle, Audie showed what one man could do with resolve. In peace, he showed what one man could endure with scars. He spoke up about PTSD before it had a name. He refused to profit from products he didn't believe in. He gave his story not to elevate himself, but to honor those who never made it home. And even in the silence of his final years, he never stopped wrestling with the ghosts. Even when the cameras rolled, even when the parades passed, even when the lights faded. Because true heroism isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do when fear tries to own you. Audie Murphy's story still matters because every generation faces its battles, some on foreign soil, some within. Every generation needs someone to show that even when you're small, poor, or forgotten, you can rise, you can stand, you can change the outcome. Audie Murphy did, not because he was born to, but because he chose to. For a while, Audie Murphy found himself sleeping on the floor with a pistol under his arm, convinced that German soldiers were still coming for him. Europe's war was over, but for him, it never really stopped. His friends suggested therapy, but Audie refused. "Soldiers don't complain," he would say. So, he buried his pain beneath layers of silence, politeness, and a quiet resilience. The young man who had once stood alone against tanks now fought a different battle, a battle he couldn't see, couldn't shoot at. He wrestled with guilt, survivor's guilt. He couldn't stop asking himself, why me? Why had he survived when so many others didn't? When he looked at his medals, he felt sick. "They don't mean anything to the dead," he said. Fame only made it worse. Wherever he went, people expected him to smile, deliver a speech, or shake hands. What he truly needed was peace, but he couldn't find it. Audie later admitted that sometimes he would lock himself in a dark room for days, refusing to eat or speak. The only company he could bear was a loaded weapon. Years later, when asked why he didn't take his own life, Audie gave the most Audie Murphy answer imaginable: because I had people who needed me. Even when drowning in despair, he thought of others. That was both his curse and his quiet, heartbreaking strength. The war gave Audie a story, and Hollywood made it a myth. In 1945, actor James Cagney invited him to Los Angeles after reading about his heroic actions. The plan was simple: turn Audie Murphy into a movie star. Audie, however, was skeptical. He didn't see himself as a hero, let alone an actor. But the offers kept coming. Studio heads loved his boyish face, his quiet demeanor, and his remarkable story. So he stayed. He took acting lessons, attended auditions, and learned scripts. He never felt comfortable, but the money was needed. And once again, he went to war, this time on screen. He starred in more than 40 films over the next 2 decades, mostly westerns, where he played quiet, reluctant gunslingers. Men who didn't seek trouble but were lethal when forced to confront it. In truth, Audie was playing himself. But one role stood apart. In 1955, he portrayed himself in To Hell and Back, the film adaptation of his own war memoir. Audie Murphy, reliving his battlefield trauma for the cameras. He didn't use a stunt double. He didn't fake the emotions, because none of it needed to be faked. Every scene pulled him back to places he tried to forget: Sicily, Anzio, Holtz. Each gunshot echoed within his chest. Every explosion rewound a memory he couldn't escape. He once said, "I was just doing my job." But now that job was packaged, sold, and replayed in theaters. And when the credits rolled, he was still alone. Behind the cameras, Audie struggled with his demons. He endured frequent nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He drank excessively, gambled recklessly, and found himself drowning in debt. At one point, he locked himself in a hotel room for a week, armed and trembling, convinced the enemy was coming. There was no enemy, just his haunting memories. Yet, he continued to show up on set, still signed autographs, still carried the weight. When asked why he didn't leave the fame behind, Audie simply said, "It helps me take care of my family." Responsibility was always at the core of who he was, not pride, not ego. In his private life, Audie sought peace in the quiet company of horses. He raised and bred quarter horses on a small ranch, spending hours brushing them, riding the trails in solitude. They didn't ask questions. They didn't expect speeches. Audie also spoke out about post-traumatic stress long before it was even named. He urged Congress to recognize the psychological wounds of war. He wrote songs, quiet, sad songs. He refused to participate in cigarette or alcohol advertisements, not wanting to set a bad example for young people who admired him. Audie understood the power of image, but he never let it overshadow the truth. In the end, Audie Murphy wore 2 uniforms, one for battle and one for the cameras. But the war never stopped wearing him down. And still, he showed up every single day. By the 1960s, Audie had become an icon, a war hero turned movie star, the embodiment of American grit. But behind the facade of that icon, he was quietly cracking under pressure. The war was always with him, lingering like a shadow that wouldn't let go. He battled insomnia, guilt, and chronic anxiety. He couldn't handle loud noises. A sudden movement could send him diving for cover. He avoided fireworks, hated crowds, and sometimes sat in silence for hours, trapped in memories that no one else could see. His fame, once a lifeline, had become a cage. Debt continued to pile up. Audie invested in oil drilling ventures and horse breeding, but most of those ventures failed. He turned down offers for cigarette and alcohol endorsements, though it cost him vital income. He refused handouts, refused pity, but privately, he was drowning. When asked why he didn't speak more openly about his struggles, he simply said, "Because I don't want to make excuses. I just want to get through the day." In 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a private plane with 5 others for a business meeting in Virginia. The weather was poor, and visibility was low. The pilot wasn't certified for instrument flight. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain, Virginia, killing all 6 people on board. Audie Murphy was 45 years old. His death stunned the nation. He had survived the deadliest combat zones of World War II, fought off German tanks with only a machine gun, lived through malaria, bullet wounds, and battles that wiped out entire units. But it was a quiet mountain on a foggy morning that finally took him. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave was simple, just his name. No medals, no titles, just as he had wanted. Even in death, Audie's grave drew crowds. Today, his grave is one of the most visited at Arlington, second only to President John F. Kennedy's. Visitors don't come for spectacle. They come to stand before the resting place of a man who gave more than anyone should be asked. A man who never sought the spotlight but carried it because others couldn't. A man who once said, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." His tombstone doesn't list his medals, but the silence surrounding it speaks volumes. In a world full of noise and headlines, Audie Murphy's story still resonates because it's not just about medals. It's about meaning. It's about what it cost to carry courage, not for a moment, but for a lifetime. Audie wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was a poor farm boy from a forgotten corner of Texas. He had no money, no education, no special training. The military rejected him at first. He was too small, too young, too light. But he became the most decorated American soldier of World War II, not because of power or politics, but because when it counted, he stood tall. When others hesitated, he moved forward. He didn't fight for glory. He fought because someone had to. He didn't take the hill for fame. He took it because someone else might die if he didn't. That kind of bravery lasts forever. It's not about medals or fame. It's about standing firm when everything else tells you to fall. Audie Murphy showed us what one man can do with determination. And in peace, he showed us what one man can endure. He spoke out about PTSD before it had a name. He refused to profit from things he didn't believe in. He gave his story not to elevate himself, but to honor the men who never made it home. He never stopped wrestling with the ghosts, even when the cameras were rolling, even when the parades passed, because true heroism isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do when fear tries to own you. Audie Murphy's story still matters because it teaches us that every generation has its battles, some on foreign soil, some within. And every generation needs someone to show that even when you're small, poor, or forgotten, you can rise, you can stand, you can change the outcome. Audie Murphy did, not because he was born to, but because he chose to.